I saw like in the programmer humor subreddit, there's the meme of like the tiny brain person and then like the big brain person and then like the galaxy brain. It was like tiny brain person. It was like 200 lines of code a day, and then big brain was like 1,000 lines of code a day, and then the galaxy brain was like negative 100 lines of code a day.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 387 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I've been here the whole time.
I'm Sam and I'm out here.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is still October 2022.
Oh, put an extra one in there. Fucked it up.
October 2022.
Yep, that's the one.
Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity.
I already did
show.
it. I already did it. I said you fucked it up. Sorry about that.
That's okay. People will figure it out.
Yep.
They'll figure out that there's profanity in this show because of the profanity.
I guess I announced
so.
it already. Yep.
All right. Now, this is round 2 of our 3-episode recorded back-to-back extravaganza. Mm-hmm. So nothing has happened since the prior episode.
I feel like we haven't lost our marbles yet. It seems like it's pretty chill still.
They're getting pretty loose in the bag, though. Yep. They're kind of jangling around in there. But let's talk about Crash Lands 2.
Okay.
Let's talk about buffs and debuffs. Okay. So
what's a buff?
What are you talking about?
So here's the deal. Crash Lands 2. You can run around in the world. You've got your weapons. You've got your swords and your daggers, and you got stuff you can use to chop trees and all that.
You got fish you can use to slap other fish. Just whatever.
Obviously, that's a staple of all games. So that we don't need to go into that one.
Nope.
But right now, the combat system is the combat and sort of like world interaction system is basically just taking a thing and whacking it against another thing. And that can take you pretty far.
Whole game franchises have been made out of that, frankly.
Yeah. But we want to start working towards some of the more interesting ways of building out your character to play differently. So maybe you want to have a character that feels more like a wizard that's doing some weird like magic-y stuff. Or maybe you want a character that feels more like a fighter who's like a beefy tanky thing that can kind of like take a beating and, send one back. Or maybe something just kind of weird that's like real fast and teleporty or something. I don't know, right? There's lots of different cool ways that you could interact with the world, fight things, navigate, whatever. But if all we have is just hitting stuff with other stuff, then none of those things are really possible, right? Mm-hmm. So the next phase of development that we're getting into with Crash Lands 2 is expanding on our ability system, which will enable those kinds of things to happen. But first, we have to layer in the concept of buffs and debuffs. So a buff and a debuff is just a positive or negative temporary effect that makes some kind of a change to what's happening. So
do you know what the origin is of these terms? Like a buff and a debuff?
I mean, you buff a car, right? Or
you buff a car.
You buff something to shine it up, which I feel like it's sort of adding some shine to yourself one way or another. Debuffing is maybe it's just the opposite. But,
so
it's like when you context of sandpaper on a car is a debuff.
Yeah, you use the wrong towel on your glasses and then they're like scratched.
Yep, that'll do it too.
You got to buff that out. Mm-hmm. But in the context of game design, people refer to things as buffs or nerfs when it comes to making something stronger or making something weaker. Mm-hmm. Buffs and debuffs, but all of these terms I only really started hearing about when I started playing online games in like the mid 2000s. Mm-hmm. I don't really know where they originated from, but
and we should say they are all the same single concept. Right, which is a temporary change to some kind of aspect of the game's mechanics. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. So a couple examples. Maybe you use. So in the original Crashes, we had the D-Bot, which is a little gadget that you would use, and it would give you an invincibility shield for like 5 seconds. So that's a buff. It's a buff that while you have that buff, you can't take damage, right? Or bad things can't happen to you.
It's like the star in Mario games.
Yeah,
invincibility.
but you can also have buffs that do things like healing. So if you eat something and that gives you healing over time, then the thing that's managing the amount of healing you get and the timers and all of that and like how fast it's delivered, that's a little buff that goes onto your character. On the flip side, you can have debuffs that are all kinds of things, whether it's being on fire or being stunned,
being
or
slowly poisoned.
being poisoned or slowed, or just being sad. That's a debuff that kind of affects everything that you're doing, right? So there's all these kinds of things, and so our first phase of expanding on the combat system is starting to build out this buff debuff system, and then exploring the ways that we can use that to start to build out what would be kind of loosely considered as like gameplay archetypes. So a fun example is what we're working on right now is sort of a stealthy, sneaky attacks of opportunity kind of a gameplay style.
An assassin kind of a
Yeah.
vibe.
So we're not quite sure on sort of like the lore connections behind it. So this is just more like a mechanical design like a mechanical prototype at this point. But we now have a new stat in the game called ambush, and we have a new gadget that allows you to become sort of like enshrouded and you become stealthy. So you're in stealth mode.
Is the animation like the Homer Simpson walking backwards into a bush?
Ideally, we don't have any animations on it at all yet, so it's kind of weird because now you're like, I'm stealthy, but you just are walking around.
I was
like
actually
normal.
thinking about that yesterday because one of my favorite animations from Levelhead is the
the
G18 bush power
That's
up.
so good.
So I don't know. We might need to bring that back here because that just cracked me up. And it's so fun because if you're doing a full body swap like that, then it's easy to do these like sort of temporary power state things. Anytime you want to just change like a piece of a character, especially doing these 2D animations, it's a pain in the ass. But if you fully swap the thing, then we could do.
I love the idea of you just like starting to look like a shrub, but then just continuing to run around at full speed as normal, And so the way we're kind of like building this stuff out then is we say, okay, so first off, we want there to be this stealth mechanic, and we want that to be something that you can use to enable other cool things. So baseline, when you go to stealth mode, then all that really happens is enemies don't really respond to you. So if they were going to be aggressive toward you, now they don't notice you anymore. So right out of the gate, that's an interesting thing that you can use to sneak past things and, unscathed and get into places that otherwise would be more dangerous, right? But that's a pretty basic interaction. Things start to get interesting when you start to blend it with other mechanics. And that's where something like this ambush stat comes in. So the ambush stat is one where whenever you attack something from stealth, then you will create a vulnerability debuff on it, which will make it take more damage from you for a few seconds. So essentially, if you have 25% ambush, then that means your target's going to take 25% more damage from you for that brief moment right after you enter or after you attack it out of stealth, right? So that then sort of further compounds into other play styles where now that you have this little window of a damage boost, then you start to think, what else can I do to capitalize on that fact? Can I, what kinds of things can I do to deliver a lot of damage in that window and exploit this little, vulnerability window? So let's say, for example, we got like a poison debuff, which we've gotten working on, which just, it just delivers poison damage over time, which again, just like stealth by itself is useful, but not,
super interesting.
Not like crazy interesting. It's just like a thing that you can do. But if we then give you a gadget that says, all right, this gadget is some kind of like a poison catalyzer. And what it does is it takes all the poison damage that's going to be delivered to a target over time and just makes it all happen instantly, right? So then if you mix all these things together, it's sort of like a build your own character archetype kind of thing. Then you could say, okay, I want to like take the stealth thing, I want this ambush thing, and then I'm going to go heavy into poison so that I can like deliver as much poison as I can during that 3-second window. And before that 3-second window is over,
pop it,
just explode them, right?
And this is fun too from a design side, from a game design perspective, because it also lets you just do stuff because that one thing is interesting, right? And you can do it like thinking about how it might interact with other stuff, because of course you should be taking into account some context, right? But you just kind of do something because it just by itself is interesting, and then without it needing to fit perfectly neatly, like as a puzzle piece with some other aspect of design, because of this like aspect of build your own adventure kind of a thing, because now people can discover that they can do weird things, right? That you might not even have thought. It's kind of like, it's like Levelhead all over again, right? Like it's a smaller number of parts that are all interesting by themselves, but it's the interaction that makes them interesting. And it's actually the players like discovering interactions that we didn't even conceive of that are particularly fun and cool and exciting. And maybe like out of whack balance wise, right? But then you get to feel like you got away with something. That's what makes it fun, you know?
Yeah. And also, part of this is about scaling, right? Where like if baseline, it's kind of challenging to fight an enemy if all you have on hand is just something you just whack them with a stick a bunch of times, right? But then like once you can do all this stuff where you can just like walk right up to them without them starting to fight you, and then you can just, quickly like deliver a bunch of poison into them and explode them before they can even react. Well, that's a whole other gameplay experience that if that becomes possible, then we may have to kind of shift the balance a bit, right?
Well, that's the fun part too, because that also on the other side, because you're talking about like what the player gets to do, right?
Yeah.
But then that also impacts what like the enemies and the bosses get to do, because
it lets us do whatever we want.
Yeah, because now we can do whatever we want too, because we can just do weird shit, and we can be like, okay, well, if the player did approach this in like this handful of ways, like it would be differentially hard depending on which one. And like, but if somebody spec'd all the way into like instant poison damage, and then there's like a category of enemy or a boss or whatever that's just immune to poison,
like robots.
Yep, like robots, or that if it's like a stealth focus, and like if the thing has some kind of an initial state where it can't take damage until it's paying attention or whatever, right? So now all of a sudden you can like you can just do interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And then be like, the player could probably figure something out. There's be some way to
does the player have tools, essentially, is the question.
But you can also then, and you can develop augmentations. So for example, if you said like, there's another gadget that takes all of the poison damage that you have on targets, right? And then like turns it into an absorb shield on you or something like that.
Or lights it on fire, and now it's fire damage instead.
Yep.
Yeah. So then you can do interesting things like maybe you're fighting something that's immune to poison, but if you can bring in some other enemies that aren't immune to poison, you can stack poison on them and then use that poison to somehow boost yourself to kill the thing that's immune to poison.
You pull their souls out using the poison, and then you turn it into a soul sword, and you stab the robot.
Right. And you don't even have to like change everything that you're doing to stop being about poison to like solve this non-poisonable problem. You can maybe swap out a couple of things instead and just, sort of pivot what you're doing into a different direction. So that's the kind of stuff that we want to enable with the buff debuff system. Right now, we just have the foundational layers of it where we have the ability to change your stats, and whether it's like this ambush stat or like whether you can stealth, and we have the ability to do healing and damage. And then things will start to get more interesting as we build in all these extra triggers that allow you to manipulate what those buffs are doing and kind of how they interact with each other. So very excited about it. It's for as like foundational as it is, it feels kind of weird that we're doing it this late in development, but I think it's necessary because we want this to be really synergistic and complex. And by complex, I just mean to have lots of possible interactions between different buffs so that we can enable all these cool play styles. But that means having really good tools for allowing the buffs to kind of point to each other and make it easy for us to design them and set them up and test them. And without the game changer tech that we built, I think, this would all have to be just straight up hard coded. Every single buff would have to be hard coded to just do exactly what it does. And if we ever had a new idea of something, there goes another 2 days of dev, right? And so it's kind of a front loading the cost of designing our ability to create these things and then just going nuts.
Well, I think it's also important to note where something like, even though you could say like a buff stuff is sort of managing state over time and like damage over time and some of these interesting tweaks, while they are foundational to a complex combat system, they are not actually foundational to just a basic combat system, right?
Yeah, the existence of the system.
Hitting stuff with sticks, right? Always works instantaneously. It's good. What they're actually, and I think the problem we've had in the past was not understanding where they fit experientially, which is what they're really for in a game like Crashlands or any game that has basically enemies that are kind of hard and require you to do some navigation around. What they're for is giving the player additional tools to overcome those particular challenges. So in the early game, you just don't have those challenges. Like, I mean, by early game, I mean like, early prototypes and stuff. There's not enough going on for it to warrant actually having these in a way that really end up being like an expansion on that system, so much as just kind of putting the player into an overpowered state, right? So much as like getting to a place where currently our next milestone is essentially getting a big boss experience put into the game. So it's like, what actually is usually the next step for a player in wanting to defeat a boss? And it's like, well, I need to power up somehow, right? I need more tools, I need more capability. And so that's basically now it's the moment to like slot this thing in and be able to actually and deliver on it. I think what's been fascinating though is, again, this is like one of the new systems developed only in the context of the Game Changer. And just how fast it came together is the same thing. We're actually last week, we did it in like 5 days. Got the thing fully initialized, right? Fully set up. It was working within like 3 or 4 days. And then it's just been building on it over the course of basically like 2 weeks now, such that now we have the buffs are applying animations, like animated effects on hit and sound effects and swing overlays and all sorts of zany stuff. And you go from having literally no buffs in the game at all, period. But it's been on the bucket list since the inception of the game, to Seth's point, almost 2 years, to just like 2 weeks. Boom, there they are. You could stealth now. We didn't have stealth. That's been a pipe dream in one of our games at some point for eons. Now it's like, took just a little bit yesterday to put stealth in. It's like, how? What?
Well, and actually yesterday it was creating stealth as a concept, making the gadget to allow you to stealth, making the ambush stat and the vulnerable stat, and making the ambush to debuff, right? and all those things. And yeah, that was just like an afternoon, just slap all those things together. Now the hard part then just is, and this is something that we're really starting to really hone in on, is that the hard part of everything now is integration. And by integration, I just mean making the thing is fine, but then where does it go?
Yeah, making the thing in isolation is, of course, easy, right?
Yeah, because if Sam wanted to, he could just over the next week he could just bang out like 10 full armor sets visually, right? But they still need to
in the game, like they're ready to go.
They could be in there, but they have to fit somewhere. They have to be connected to things in the world. And the question is like, are they crafted? Do you find them? Do they come from bosses? Do they come from quests and everything? Which means understanding the context in which all the rest of the armor is delivered.
What are they made of? This is actually
what are they made of?
The weirdest part's making a crafting game. I think people may not necessarily consider before heading down a crafting game path. This is something we've definitely cornered ourselves on with Crashlands in particular, because part of the fun thing is the fact that everything you see is made of stuff that you like. It actually is made of the stuff that you harvested. It's not like everything turns into copper and it's just metal that's orange now and whatever, who cares? It's made of like straps of bark or whatever weird stuff. And that particular commitment, makes things really fucking hard. Because you can't actually build an armor set until you know where it goes in the tech tree and what it's made of, which means you have to know what the shape of like basically there's a lot of these like circular dependencies.
Well, it's part of the fun part though too is that there's so many ways to actually approach this from like where do you start and work from. But this actually allows you to do it in a really fun direction, which is basically to like literally build a world first with like an ecology and like kinds of plants and then to come up with like, what do these plants do? Like how do they behave? Right? And then you can, as you build out this ecology, you can then you can just say like, okay, well, this is what we've got, right? I already know what it looks like. And this is like roughly how much of the game this kind of represents. So how much stuff needs to be made of this stuff, right? And then you can kind of go from that direction, but go in the other direction of being like, okay, I made all this dope armor, right? How do I slot it in is a much more challenging direction, right? Like that's the fun of this kind of a system where you can, by having things not have to be like really coupled to like the idea of power leveling, and try to make it more broad and more open worldy, right? So things are just a little flatter. And also designing systems that don't need, again, they aren't like puzzle pieces fitting together. They're more like a whole bunch of interesting stuff. That's just what it is, right? Then you remove a whole bunch of requirements on yourself from a development perspective in the context of a very complex system.
Yeah.
By basically saying like, okay, cool, we can like, if we start with the world and work out from there, right? Then you just get to kind of have fun making cool stuff. That's kind of like what the end result is, right? And then just be like, what's missing now, right? The world's here. I'm walking around in it. What's missing now, you know? And then just go make that thing.
Yeah, and you can kind of pull on those experiential threads of like, let's say we've got a bunch of, you know, continuing the talk about like poison, right? So let's say we've got a bunch of sort of like poisony things, but it's still the case that if you're playing as a character who's doing a lot of this poisoning, there's moments during gameplay where you're like, oh man, like I really wish I could have done blah. You know, like I had all these poisons out here, and I'm like my one gadget was on cooldown, and I was really feeling like if I had a button that did this, right, that it would have been super cool, right? Like maybe if I had a button that like would like purge all the poisons from my targets, but then like paralyze them, you know, or something like that. So as you're playing through the game, you can kind of feel out moments that would be really cool and interesting to have, and then you know we can get those items conceived of and integrated into the story and stuff. So there is like one of the big challenges right now that we're still working through is that Crashlands 2 is a lot more lateral and less vertical in terms of progression. So a lot of it is about going to other places in the world and uncovering these alternative, you know, recipes and other things to craft and other ways to play. But it's not necessarily just like, oh, I made level 1 armor, now I made level 2 armor, now I made level 3 armor, and just kind of like, you know, moving straight up through.
Things have to kind of just be decoupled, you know, like as much as possible. It has to be like things are independent because you can't possibly like model, given a thing you want to do, every possible way the player could experience that. And with the combination of all the other things, because like a player could end up in like very late game doing whatever, and then come back to the first part of the game, right? Like, and maybe there's some stuff they haven't seen there. And now what happens when they see it at that point, right? And like, if you have to try to predict every possible combinatorial outcome, it's literally so infinite. There's
just no way.
Yeah. So the only way to do it is to try to figure out how do you make it so that things being out of balance isn't a big deal and it's just interesting, right? And how do you make it so that you can just do stuff that is interesting and fill in obvious gaps of like overarching kinds of experiences? Like the story needs to progress at a decent pace, and like we need some boss fights that you should be able to get to, right?
Feel like they can progress, you know.
People feel like there's like you got to have all those kinds of aspects there, but it all has to somehow be as like loosely coupled as you can make it, while still also allowing for those interactions to be interesting. Because if it's loosely coupled, but then there aren't any interactions, and that's like the most boring scenario, right? So, yeah, it's challenging.
Yeah, so that's our biggest challenge is integration. Then of being able to make all this stuff doesn't necessarily mean that you know it's still easy to weave all of it together into like a great contiguous.
But the hard part is where it should be, which is the design part, right? It's like how do we do because we can like now we're removing all the constraints on capacity to deliver a given design, right?
Yeah,
and so now all of the limitations are on
it's on deciding what to do.
Yeah, which is
as opposed to how do we even do this thing that we
it's the best place, but it also means you do have to figure out what your constraints are because you can't operate without constraints. And so still trying to basically saying like given like everything is really complicated and infinite interactions, so how do we treat those as like useful constraints to help guide the stuff we then decide to do and like how they interact?
Yeah. So it's I'm excited to sort of like conceive of all the different cool stuff that we want, and then sort of figure out how to weave that all together and see what we can deliver. Because I think the buff stuff is part of it. We also have like upcoming projectile systems, so we can make all kinds of like bombs and spears and things that you can kind of throw out, fireballs, whatever it is. And again, that'll be an entirely new layer of cool stuff to do. So man, it's coming along. It's going real fast. Yeah. All right, you guys ready to get us some questions?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. First question comes from Rarzip7Z. Oh, and these questions come from podcast.bscotch.net. Rarzip7Z says, how do you bros deal with the possibility of getting carpal/cubital tunnel syndrome or just repetitive stress injuries in general while working all day with computers?
Sam probably has the most extensive answer to this one. Yep.
Yeah. So I started having a bit of wrist trouble last year. And I think it was actually in part because of course, we do work on computers all day. And then I use a tablet for, like a Cintiq to draw on. So I'm holding a pencil all day, basically.
Which is one of the most unnatural, like hand kind of configurations.
Yeah, it can be a lot. So I think the first thing is recognizing where it's coming from. So actually what had initially started it for me, weirdly enough, was during the pandemic, I started doing body weight workouts at home. It was doing, as part of that, typically push-ups is a very common thing, which actually doing some push-ups. Yeah, flat-handed push-ups is actually very wrist strenuous. And so if you put that together with like a daily regimen that is just holding a fucking pencil all day, turns out that kind of sets you up, tees you up for some nonsense. So one is basically looking at not just your work-related stuff, but also other aspects of your life where you're going to be inflaming these things in ways that maybe you didn't really quite anticipate. So everything from holding your phone to whatever else. Basically find ways to ease the whole system back a little bit as far as impact there, whether that is through, like I have a funky kind of ergonomic belly thing on my stylus now for drawing that makes it easier to hold. I use kind of voice dictation stuff.
Guppy.
Yeah, I use more voice dictation stuff for my phone now instead of just trying to type all the time. Things like that, kind of just peel back a bit in a variety of areas.
Are you using Talon still for hotkeys on desktop and stuff? Or
we've been pairing so much I haven't done like a ton of art for the last like 4 or 5 weeks or so. So once I'm more solo and just kind of doing some art stuff, I'll have Talon back on. But for the most part, it's just been the usual stuff.
Yeah, but in that context, what Talon's letting you do is the stuff where you like move your hand a lot. Yeah, you can just say things instead.
Yeah. So there's that, and then the other is to recognize and kind of pair your activities in a way that makes it so you're not necessarily like doubly straining stuff. And what I mean by that is the place where I think I got pretty messed up was actually in, I think it was around March or so this year. I was working on that animatic cutscene for Crashlands 2. Shitload of drawing every day.
So just 8 hours a day. Just drawing.
Yeah, 8 hours a day, just drawing stuff straight. And then got really into Elden Ring. So 8 hours a day drawing, and then pop off and spend 2-3 hours playing on a controller on the Xbox. And
actually, holding a console controller is also kind of bad because your hands kind of come together and then your wrists kind of go back a bit.
Yeah.
So it's not actually that well suited to good ergonomics.
Yeah, depending on the game, I found, and of course, Elden Ring it's pretty stressful because you're getting killed all the time. So depending on the game, like I'm very tense when I'm playing, kind of more of those sharp games where you got to be really fast on the controls and stuff. Kind of get a death grip on that controller. So that combination of things threw me into the spot where I basically was developing carpal tunnel. My wrist started hurting. While clicking, it was hurting, all sorts of stuff like that. So that's where a bit more of the extensive kind of like, okay, like quit fucking around, basically, when it comes to some of your tools and things. And it's annoying because the reality is that it's like a back injury where, once you've been injured in one of these ways, it's more likely that you are going to get injured again in the same way. You're sort of like teeing yourself up for future problems, essentially, by allowing it to happen once. And I think that's the big takeaway, which is, if it is the case that you do computer work or you do hand-related work all the time, do not make the mistake of saying, I don't have any problems, so I'm not going to like invest in some ergonomic stuff, right?
Yeah.
Keep yourself.
Stay ahead of it.
Stay ahead of it. It's a big thing. Yeah, big thing we talked about in the studio, staying ahead of it. And so go ahead, get an ergonomic keyboard or mouse or whatever. Get your setup, working, and also find ways in other areas of your life to pull some of the strain off of your hands.
So you talking about the pencil thing does make me wonder, like, is there a concept of a thing that you can like just put onto your finger and just draw with your finger as opposed to having to like hold a...
Well, the issue is for most people, myself included, like your fingers, weirdly enough, like if you just had your finger, you have to be so tense to get it to like do exactly what you want that you'd end up kind of clawing anyways. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it's just sort of a challenging thing being very precise. I think it's just,
because you're using your whole arm actually.
Yeah, you use your whole arm.
Well, you're using all of your fingers holding the pencil plus your wrist.
Because it's actually less about like holding the pencil. That is definitely an influence. It's actually more about what your wrist has to do to have a flat surface that you're then somehow touching in a really controlled, careful, precise way, right? And this is the same thing with keyboards, right? It's like
typing. Yep.
It's that your hands aren't designed to lay down flat on a keyboard, right? That's it. Actually, even if you're just like sitting here, you just like flip your arms over flat, you can just feel it's like just slightly uncomfortable. Assuming you don't already have RSI, right? Then it's probably very uncomfortable. But yeah, the number one thing for all this stuff is, as Sam said, stay ahead of it, and that's all about consciously designing both your tooling and like the hardware and like the stuff that you're physically using, right? But also what it means to interact with those things. So like the number one thing is basically like, where's your monitor and desk and keyboard positioned relative to each other? Because the monitor should be at the top of the monitor should basically be where your eyeballs are, like height wise, right? And then if you start there and like work your way down, right? Then somehow the keyboard should be, if you're standing, you're looking at the top of your monitor, and then you take your little T-Rex arms and you kind of put them down in T-Rex 90-degree-ish position, like a little lower, right? That's where your hands should be. So is that where your keyboard is, right? And if not, then how do you get it there, right? Yeah. So this is where things like monitor arms plus standing desks come together so that you can choose the relative positions of those like vertical stack of things so that all of that's optimized, right? And after that, it's like, okay, what kind of keyboard do you have? And when you're using your keyboard, how much do you need to use it because of how you're approaching the work, right? Because like in my case, I have so much tooling, like so many things are happening automatically in my development environment that most of what I have to do actually is think about stuff, right? Because once I figure out how to do something, then it's really easy to do it. And so I actually don't have to type as much as it seems like I should be typing, right? Because I just have to spend so much time thinking.
Surprised me. I saw like in the programmer humor subreddit, there was, the meme of like the tiny brain person and then like the big brain person and then like the galaxy brain. It was like tiny brain person. It was like 200 lines of code a day. And then big brain was like 1,000 lines of code a day. And then the galaxy brain was like negative 100 lines of code. It's actually that, which is that one thing that I've come to appreciate is that as I've gotten better at programming, more of my time is just spent reading code.
Yep.
And thinking about what to do.
Especially in a large code base that's growing over time, because everything has to happen in the context of that ever-growing existing code base.
Yeah, because if I'm having to write 1,000 lines of code to do something fairly straightforward, then there's a good chance that there's a much better way to do it that doesn't take so much freaking code.
I think unfortunately, it's not quite the same on the art side.
The art is just a one-to-one. Like if you need art, you got to make the art.
Yeah, but it is the case that you can. And this is actually there's a degree of it though, which is that a lot of artists talk about mileage, especially early artists and people training up still, which is just the idea like there's this. I still think it's just one of the dumbest ideas I've heard. I feel like the heart's in the right place, but it is dumb, which is this whole like, you got like a 10,000 bad drawings, so get out before you get to the good ones. So just like get them out of the way. So, just crank out those drawings.
Yeah, right. Like the magic number is like, that's just a random number pulled out of a hat. But
and it's not like making bad drawings makes you better.
That is the
it's always thoughtful and consciously critiqued.
Yes.
Work.
And so you'll see this with concept artists sometimes too, where they'll have like a prompt that they got or something, and then you just see like this flurry of work come out of it. But it's not necessarily well thought out. The pictures are cool, but as far as like you could have done a tenth of the pictures if you took an hour to maybe look up some more references, do some more thinking about how it integrates with the game, do some more story work, etc. So I think there is there is a degree of that. I think as you get better on the art side of the planning part being a bigger and bigger part of the whole experience, where then how many things you end up needing to draw to get to the end goal, I think actually does go down as you, or can go down if you're, I think, taking the right approach as you get kind of further along.
I think it's the leverage of the physical act of you doing whatever the work is.
Exactly.
Keeps on getting amplified by the pre-work that you learn how to do a better and better job of over time. But also then when you do finally like sit down and start putting pen to tablet or hands to keyboard or whatever, the way that you have figured out how to really use your tools effectively. Because like I look at people use like expert Photoshop digital artists, right? And the shit that they're doing with like the different kinds of brushes and like the different kinds of things that software can do. Where so if you're talking about like the concept of mileage, right? It's like how many times do they need to like put the pen to the tablet to then end up with the outcome that they want? And if you look at the kind of shit they're doing, it's like they're like, oh, I need to draw like a string of pearls, right? And they just go grab this brush that just automatically makes a string of pearls or whatever the fuck, right? So that but then like in this like really smart way where they can then kind of like they understand that tool so
there's tool
input requirements go down and down and down. So I think that's so much of it is about your tooling and your physical environment is about the leverage. Is how do you minimize how much input is required to get the output you're looking for?
So really, it's all about your post-mortem ability. It's like after you do each thing, even if there's like a subconscious kind of reflection going on where you're like, how did that go? And how could it go better and faster next time? You know, how can I get better results with the same input, or how can I give less input to get the same results, right? Or potentially, how can I do a lot less effort to get an almost as good outcome, which in some cases is totally fine, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's something else that I think, like you're saying, Adam, keyboards are kind of a big culprit. There's a few things that I have going on, and one thing that I wish I had going on that I haven't figured out yet. But people talk about standing desks as like a big thing, being able to kind of like just switch between modes. But for me, the biggest thing of having the standing desk was actually just the fact that it can adjust down.
Yeah.
Yep.
And almost every desk. So desks are built
they're made for like a 6'1" person or something.
Yeah, because of course, if you make your desk too small, then tall people can't use it.
Yeah, you can always get a taller chair, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so most desks and chairs are just too tall for most people, right? For at least half of people, if not more than half of people. So the way that your like legs are being compressed on the chair from kind of like slightly hanging down and not actually like having your feet make full contact with the floor, that's a problem. But also that most desks are still at the same height that they were when computers weren't really a thing, and where most of the work you did was on paper, where you needed the desk at a good writing height, which is much higher
up.
Yep. Yeah. And so getting we got the I can't remember what the name of this, the uplift desk.
Yes,
I think.
Uplift desk. Yeah.
So my uplift desk is lowered like 2 inches lower than my previous desk was.
Mine is all the way to the bottom. Whatever.
Yeah, because when I'm sitting in my chair, actually, like the tops of my legs are actually up against the bottom of the desk, and my keyboard is essentially where it would be as if it was almost sitting on my lap, like slightly higher than sitting on my lap. Because when you're sitting in a chair, and I also removed the arms from my chair because chair arms don't lower enough.
They're too high.
To allow you to, so like I've done all these things to kind of make it so that I can just like sit down at my desk and just be in a neutral resting position and just have my hands on the keyboard. But the thing that has really kind of like still thrown a wrench in everything is that the numpad on my keyboard is on the wrong side.
Mm-hmm.
Numpad
mouse has to be way over there.
You can get like a USB detachable one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I need to do something because numpads should be on the left.
Yep.
Because your mouse is on the right, and so you need to have this.
Well, really, they should always be detachable so that right-handed or left-handed people can flip it to the opposite side. You know, whichever side.
So my mouse. So basically, to go from typing to using the mouse, which is an incredibly common movement, no matter what you're doing with a computer. You always got to jump over the numpad, and there's just
I got to jump
huge
like
dead space.
It looks like about 6 inches, maybe something like that.
So like from where your right hand needs to go from home row over to your mouse, it's probably like a foot. It's just a huge amount of space for no reason, and that's the thing. That's a big problem that I need to solve. But like you said, I can get like a detachable numpad and put that where I want it and stuff like that. But it's all these little things that just add up. And it's even like I have a microphone with a boom, or I have a mounted headset mic, but no matter what, I don't want to have to be like leaning over to be able to talk into my mic, right? Or I've got my monitors on these adjustable arms so that I can get them positioned so that they're exactly at the right distance and height and everything. And so like I'm also using 2 monitors, and I don't like it for the most part because looking at your second monitor is always going to fuck up your neck.
Always bad.
Like it's just over there. Whether you put it like above, now you're like looking up. If it's down, you're no matter what, it's always in a bad spot. And so I just use the second monitor for like when we're screen sharing or collaborating. I just have people. That's my video monitor. So like we just are on video all day.
It's the passive hanging out on video, but you're still mostly working on your own thing. Space.
Working in a cafe, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
And so whenever we go into like discussion mode, that's when I literally just stop looking at my main monitor and I just like pivot over to my second monitor, and which is also kind of a nice thing to do because that way I'm not like, the person who I'm talking to knows that I'm looking at them, right? There's an eye contact kind of thing there. As opposed to me just like they can't tell whether I'm, ignoring them and just tabbed in and just like looking at something else, So yeah, there's a lot of considerations to it. But
I just tell people, I'm like, when I'm looking what looks like to the right away from you, I'm actually looking at you. That's what I always tell people when we're doing that stuff.
Which is to this day very hard to.
Oh yeah, I know it's weird.
Adam's like, I'm only listening to you when I'm looking away.
But that's only true for a while, because then as soon as we have a discussion that goes on for longer than a few minutes, then I always move the window to in front of me. So now I am looking at you when I'm looking
and then
at you.
So yeah, there are a lot of aspects to that. Trying to like maneuver.
Everybody has to
different
be kind
pieces,
of adaptive,
Yeah. But I mean, to stay ahead of it, every little thing matters. And if you start to feel at all like any kind of like, wow, my neck hurts, or, to just take a beat and try to figure out how to fix some things.
And to Sam's point, it is everything in your life. Like the thing I'm going to guarantee you, like, which is statistically for people listening to this, your TV is the wrong fucking height. It is too high. I guarantee you that's the case.
Every time I go, if I get like an Airbnb or something, and the TV is like mounted on the top of the ceiling, and I'm like, what in the hell alien lives here?
People always put it over a fireplace.
It's too high.
Which then forces it to be.
Yeah, it should be like the top of your pupils should be horizontally lined up with the top of the screens you're looking at. Whether it's a TV, whether it's a computer monitor or whatever, like that's where it should actually be, right? Well, we bought the lowest console we could find, and then I cut the legs off of it to get it low enough that I could. And now, like when we watch TV, I just feel great the whole time. I don't have no neck pain, right? It's the looking a tiny bit up, even a little bit, is one of those things that like it seems like it shouldn't be a big deal, but that's like the thing. If you look up even a little bit, and definitely like to the left or right, like that's what's going to fuck up your neck. But if you're doing that like with your TV in the evening and you sit down the next day and have good ergonomics at your computer, it doesn't matter, because sure, you're letting yourself rest a little bit, right? But it's never going to be perfect. It's always uncomfortable to be doing it. You're just still building up because you haven't fixed that other problem, right?
Especially if you're gaming, because you'll get into that. Gaming. You'll get into that. I'm chilling on the couch. I'm sitting there. I've got my elbows on my knees, and I'm sort of like leaned over with my controller. But then if your TV is up, then now you've got to basically like wrench your neck back so far to see it that it's just going to be a huge problem. So when you are in your early 20s, you can do that stuff all day and you don't feel anything at the time.
Yeah, yet.
Right. But you're accruing a debt that will come due.
But it's not actually payable because the interest grows faster than you can pay it down the principal. So
yeah. So invest early. It's like a 401k for your body. Yep. You want to start maximizing your ergonomics 401k right out of the gate, because once you're in your 30s, you're in your 40s, and everybody around you is they're just dropping like flies. It's like a war zone, right? And you'll just be fit as a fiddle, no problem, because you thought about the stuff ahead of time and you stayed ahead of it.
Yeah, it is the case that since getting my standing desk and then getting everything like vertically lined up, I spend the first half of every day just standing. Just kind of keep my energy up, And then most afternoons I end up sitting back down at some point. But once I started to do that, like I don't have any like neck stuff or back stuff or whatever going on at the end of the day. Unless I play video games, because when I'm playing video games, I'm so intense that I'm leaning forward and I can't stop myself, And that I can't figure out how to manage that, because whether I'm sitting or standing, the outcome is the same. So that's what I'm still trying to figure out how to deal with. But yeah,
that's just a practice thing. Like we were joking about how once I got my Fitbit, I learned that my heart rate actually goes down when I'm playing video games. That's my Zen time where no matter what's happening, I'm just super chill.
Yep.
So anyways, all right. Well, that's all the time we have for this week's episode. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Jen Coster, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, go to podcast.bsketch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.